Okay, class, so this is going to be the third lesson in a series I'm doing on grammar and style. So I'm starting with some of the basic rules first, so then we can talk more in detail about style. And this is going to be a two-part. So I'm going to break this lesson into two videos. In the first, I'm going to just kind of demonstrate what some of the rules are and the different sentence types and sentence errors are. And then in the next video, I'm going to show you how this can relate to our style, and I'll do some practice with this. So, quick review. So things you need to know in order to get the most out of this video. You'd want to be, at this point, fairly comfortable with identifying subjects and verbs in a sentence and being able to identify the difference between an infinitive or a present participle phrase or a past participle phrase as opposed to a verb in a sentence. And that means you also want to be able to recognize the difference between a phrase and a clause. Remember, phrases don't have subjects and verbs in them, while clauses do, and you want to recognize that there are different types of clauses. So the main ones that we focused on in a previous video were independent clauses and dependent clauses. And remember, independent clauses could stand alone, while dependent clauses could not. They always began with a dependent word that made the idea no longer complete on its own. Okay, so a quick note on grammar. I really like this quote, and I really like the video off to the side. So in the video, you can see a picture of James Harden, and you might be familiar with this famous step back technique. And so in this technique, what's interesting about that technique, I'll play it again for those who haven't seen it before. It looks like he takes multiple steps when you're only allowed to take two. So you have a gather and two steps. But Harden he's read through the rule book, and he's mastered the art of bending the rules and pushing the edge of the rules. So it really relates to the quote here by Roy Peter Clark. You can't break a rule and turn it into a tool unless you know it's a rule in the first place. And so many people just figured you can only take two steps, and so they didn't even think to implement a move like this into their game. And so the same applies for our writing style and our writing mechanics. We really do and can take a lot of flexibility with how we write. Okay, so a few basic rules. So if you remember, a complete sentence should contain a subject and a verb, and it also should be an independent clause, meaning it should be a complete thought. So that makes a lot of sense. We should have a subject, something to talk about, and we should have something to say about that, a predicate or otherwise a verb. Okay? You can connect additional independent clauses together as long as you use special punctuation. So that could be a comma with one of the FANBOYS. These are also referred to as coordinating conjunctions, and those include the words for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So we use a comma with those words when we're connecting two independent clauses. You can use a semicolon, which people often know as the sort of the winky face when people used to use emoticons. And so for semicolons, you can take any two sentences or independent clauses that were similar enough and join them together. And this is especially useful if you don't want your reader to sort of stop there and start arguing with you. If two ideas are really important, they should go together, and you want your reader to put them together, a semicolon is a very useful tool there. Sometimes you can also join two independent clauses with a colon, although this is less common as a semicolon. Colons often introduce some sort of clarifying idea, and the clarifying idea that comes after the colon is often a list or a quotation from a reading, and so it's not always a complete sentence on the other side of the colon. And again, also a little less common than a semicolon, but certainly possible, you can use dashes to connect two independent clauses as well. And you can include, quick note too, you can include as many phrases as you like into your sentence. They do not change the quality of the sentence. So what we're focusing on for our sentence types is the number of clauses. Okay, so there are 4 sentence types. We have a simple sentence. This is your basic sentence. Usually it's just subject, verb, object. It could be a command where the subject is implied, or it could be a question, but it's just one independent clause. And a compound sentence is kind of like what it sounds like. It's 2 or more independent clauses, and remember, you need some sort of special punctuation or way of joining the two independent clauses together. So you can use a comma and a fanboy, you can use a semicolon, you can use a colon, or you can use dashes. Then we can also use dependent clauses. So number 3 is called a complex sentence. This type of sentence contains one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. And remember, you can have as many dependent clauses as you like in a sentence in this type of sentence. So number 4 is called a compound complex sentence. And these tend to be longer, but again, we're talking about the type of clauses in a sentence. So we're not talking about word length, we're not talking about phrases, specifically the sets of subjects and verbs within the sentence and whether they're independent or dependent. So for this type of sentence, we have 2 or more independent clauses and 1 or more dependent clauses. And the main tip is, again, just look for the subjects and verbs first. So as soon as you can identify those, you can then identify where the clauses are, and then you can determine, is this clause independent or dependent? And one of the methods that helps with identifying those is to try to memorize those dependent words that I showed you in the last video. Here's an example of a simple sentence. So a simple sentence, again, it contains 1 independent clause. So Andrew is growing tomatoes in his zombie apocalypse garden. So the subject is me, Andrew, and the verb phrase is growing. So that is our predicate, and then tomatoes are the object. They're what I'm growing. And then in his zombie apocalypse garden, that's just the preposition, so that has no effect on the quality of the sentence. So that's a simple sentence, subject, verb, object. Okay, so now here's an example of a compound sentence. A compound sentence contains 2 or more independent clauses and is joined by one of the fanboys, for and or, but, or, yet so, a semicolon, a colon, or dashes. And in our first independent clause, it says Andrew grew lettuce. So Andrew is a subject, grew is a verb. Then you'll see in yellow, I've highlighted the comma and the coordinating conjunction, or the fanboy, which is but, and which connects the next independent clause, which is snails ate it. So snails is a subject, ate is a verb, and it is the object, being the lettuce. So it's a pronoun that takes the place of lettuce. Okay, so next we move on to the complex sentence. This is my favorite type of sentence, or one of my favorite types of sentence. I also like compound complex sentences. And something to keep in mind is that the more dependent clauses you use, the faster readers will move through your text. So if you want to slow down the reader for, sort of a dramatic effect, use shorter sentences or use more independent clauses. If you want to speed things up, use dependent clauses. And something that I don't always actively think about as a writer, but certainly can play a role in how you argue and how you convey meaning, is that a dependent clause, or what's often referred to as a subordinate clause, is sub. It's lower, it's less important. And so it really can convey the balance of the main ideas. And so if 2 things are equal, I might use a compound sentence. But if one idea is more important, I might place that in the independent clause. And that's the thing that I want to get across to the reader. So in this example, what's less important or less emphasized is that I grew the lettuce. So although Andrew grew lettuce is the dependent clause, the main idea that I'm trying to convey is that the lettuce was eaten by the snails, and so now I no longer have lettuce. Okay, so although Andrew grew lettuce is the dependent clause, it's an adverb clause. The independent clause is it was eaten by the snails. Okay, and last but certainly not least, we arrive at the compound complex sentence. And so this sentence can contain 2 or more independent clauses. Again, you're using either a semicolon or a comma to fanboy, or a colon or dashes to connect the independent clauses. And you should see 1 or more dependent clauses along with that. So the 2 or more independent clauses make it compound. The 1 or more dependent clause makes it complex. So it's a compound complex sentence. And so this example, which you may have seen before, I believe it might be somewhere on our Canvas site. It states dream or nightmare. Then here we have the independent clause. We have to live our experience as it is. And so the clause as it is, that's the dependent clause. And then you notice in yellow, I highlighted the fanboy, which connects that section to the next independent clause. We have to live it away. And so those are the 4 sentence types. Next, I want to move on to some of the common errors that we see. So now that you know what you're allowed to do and the different sentence types and what you can connect and what you can't connect, this helps us to identify what are often referred to as run-ons and fragments. And that's when a sentence either contains too many independent clauses, or it doesn't contain proper punctuation, or doesn't contain enough independent clauses. So it means it's lacking a subject or a verb somewhere. So in the first example, I'm talking about two types of run-ons. The two types that are very common are called comma splices. And so you may have heard it or seen these before. You may have seen your teachers write comma splice on your essays and give them back to you. This is where a sentence, two sentences are joined by just a comma. And so a comma isn't enough. You need a comma and a fanboy, or you need a semicolon there, or you can make one dependent. So in the first example, Mary likes shopping, comma, she's a shopaholic. Those are both independent clauses, and you can see there's a subject and verb said on each side. Mary is the subject, likes is the verb, she is the subject, is the verb. So we need to maybe make one of those dependent. So we could say, although Mary likes shopping, comma, she is a shopaholic. That would fix the sentence. Okay, in the next example, we see a fuse sentence, and a fuse sentence is basically the exact same thing as a comma splice. In fact, it's less common because most students and most people hear that, oh, I really do need a stop there, so they put a comma. It's just they don't realize that it really ought to be a period instead of a comma. So a fuse sentence just puts the two independent clauses together. Mary likes shopping, she is a shopaholic. You can see that the sentence is basically identical to the first, it just doesn't have the comma. Now, one problem with the fuse sentence is that sometimes students hear that there's something wrong, so they put a comma there, but they haven't quite solved the problem. It's still a run-on, it just changed from a fuse sentence to a comma splice. So remember to put a comma and a coordinating conjunction, one of the fanboys, or to put a semicolon, or to make one side dependent. Okay, so the next major sort of sentence error that I see is a fragment. And fragments, sometimes we'll write them on purpose, but sometimes I see them used and they don't need to be there. They don't need to be fragments. And so if I wanted to write a fragment for effect, I would, but in many cases, I don't think that choice is being actively made for effect. I think that sometimes it's just missing a subject and verb. So in the first example, we see a fragment, while shopping, period, Mary could not control herself, period, she is a shopaholic. So that first phrase, while shopping, it doesn't have a subject and verb in it, so we need to connect it with a comma to the Mary. So just change that first period to a comma, while shopping, comma, Mary could not control herself, period, she is a shopaholic. And now you have two correct sentences. And so most of the time when you see a fragment, really that phrase just needs to be connected to a sentence either that comes right after it or comes right before it. Oh, another quick note too, I mentioned this, I sort of mentioned this in the last video, but I didn't mention it enough. Sometimes we'll see adverb clauses at the beginning of a sentence. You may have been told by your high school teachers or other teachers that you shouldn't start a sentence with because. Well, the word because starts an adverb clause. It's a very important word for conveying cause and effect. And so you absolutely can start a sentence with because. You just don't want to put a period at the end of the dependent clause. You want to use a comma and connect it to the next sentence. And so you can start sentences with because. You should start sentences with because when necessary. And so I hope that you can now make that addition into your writing if you've been afraid of doing it. So that leads us to my last slide, which is another video of James Harden. Many of you actually immediately recognize this video. This was a video in which he sort of embarrasses a really good, well-known defender named Wesley Johnson. And the point of this video is once you know the rules, you can really start to take advantage of the rules and take your writing to that next level.